Okay, so last week we were talking about the problem of sin and the role it plays as we're sort of narrowing the scope of our discussion. You know, we kind of started with real general information about logic and first principles and things like that, and then going into the proof of God, and now we're sort of zeroing in on some of the specifics within Christianity, what that Christianity addresses. So we began talking about the issue of the problem with sin. So this is what we present to people. This is what people need to understand in order to really grasp the importance of the gospel message, is that the main problem is sin, that we are broken. And again, remember the differentiation. The main problem is not sins. The main problem is not our behavior. The main problem is that we're broken. The main problem is that we're flawed. And we're lost, and that we're in need of salvation. So now the question can be asked, okay, fine. If we accept, for the sake of argument, that is the problem, that I'm broken, that I am lost, and I am in need of salvation, well, why is Christianity the answer? You know, why must the solution be Jesus and Christianity? Aren't there all kinds of other religions out there that offer options for our salvation, for fixing us if we're broken? And the reality is no. There is no other religion that that addresses this problem, because the main difference between Christianity and other religions is that other faiths propose to show the way to God. They have some kind of a path for you to follow, a philosophy for you to adopt, some way to make you a better person, some way to help you clear your mind, or whatever it may be. It's sort of, it's a path. And that includes really all religions, even one closest to Christianity, Judaism. It's still sort of a path to God. Here are the laws, here are the rules. Keep them, and you will attain the path to God. And when I speak of Judaism, I'm speaking not of biblical Judaism, because biblical Judaism from the Old Testament teaches faith as the path to God, as the way to God. But I'm talking about Judaism today. So all the other religions sort of, whether they have founders or whether they have doctrine or whether they have philosophies, sort of address the issue of how can we get to God? What is the way to God? Christianity says that Jesus offers himself as the way to God. Jesus does not say, this is the way to God. He says, I am the way to God. And that may sound like, we're just sort of quibbling over semantics and that kind of thing, but it's not, because it's not a path, it's not a system or a formula that we follow, it's not some philosophy that we adopt. It has to be a surrender to a person. It has to, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. None shall come unto the Father but by me. He said, I am the resurrection and the life. There is and we'll get into this, why it's different. It's not just an adoption of Jesus' principles. It's not looking at Jesus as being a teacher and saying, well, his principles, if we follow them, then that's the path to God. And, Jesus would say, no. Following my principles, following my philosophies will not get you to know God. Knowing me will get you to know God. And that is the fundamental difference. And, one of the things that he brings up in the book is he sort of brings a differentiation for the sake of trying to make things clear between religion, I think I can spell this word, and the gospel. And that religion can be understood as salvation through moral efforts. Salvation through a way. Some path, some formula, something you can do, a philosophy you can latch onto, that will be the path to salvation. The gospel says salvation is by grace, by sheer grace. It is not something we can attain to. It is not something we can reach. It is not something we can strive for. It is something that is just given to us, and it's a completely different system altogether. It's a different paradigm. It's a whole different way of looking at things. So this goes back to this issue of the problem being about sin and people's perception of sin. And understanding that it's not about behavior, that even the good things we do, the tree in the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It wasn't the tree of the knowledge of evil. And God didn't want them to eat any of the fruit. There's the good, what's been called the good side of the tree and the bad side of the tree. But both sides were something that God did not want us to mess with. Because the Bible says that our righteousness is as filthy rags. It doesn't say our sin is as filthy rags. Our righteousness is as filthy rags. So, and sin, as we talked about last week, can sort of be defined as being self-centeredness. It's about focusing on yourself. And there's two forms of self-centeredness, and one is being very bad, and the other is being very good and becoming self-righteous about it. In the book, he gives sort of an illustration about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And really, first I read it and I didn't quite get where he was going, and then I really got it and thought that's kind of a great example, because he talks about how in the story, Dr. Jekyll is sort of faced with this idea that he knows that he has evil thoughts and intentions in his heart. So he decides to come up with this potion that will divide the two, so that during the day he can be as good as he can possibly be, and at night then the evil part comes out. And he was shocked at how evil he actually was. When he really came face with himself as Mr. Hyde, he was shocked at how evil he actually was in himself. And so he decided that he would begin to do good things, do philanthropic things, help people, and try to do as many good things as possible to try to stave off Mr. Hyde. And that if he could be as good as he could possibly be. And then it says at one point he was sitting there thinking about all the good things that he was doing. And he started thinking, boy, I'm really good. I've really been doing great things, and I'm really even better than anybody that I ever knew. And the next thing he knew, he was Mr. Hyde. Because his goodness had driven him to self-righteousness and to pride, which was just as evil as all the evil things. So we look at the two forms of self-centeredness. There is the first form, which most people would easily recognize, which is that, look, I'm going to live my life my way. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. It's a life absorbed with egotism and self-absorption, regard for my own interests instead of others. And this really is at the foundation of what causes most of the misery in the world. Is this sort of selfish, self-centered attitude about I don't care about anybody else, and I'm just going to do what I want to do. And that's the first form of self-centeredness. That's the obvious form. But the second one, even if somebody has a perception of Christianity or of Jesus, and they see Jesus as a great teacher, and they say, look, I want to use him as an example, and I want to adopt his teachings. And they see Jesus as a teacher but not a savior. And they say, well, I'm going to avoid sin. I'm gonna just be a good person, and they're trusting in their own goodness, and ironically, they're sort of trying to save themselves by following the teachings of Jesus. The problem is this is not salvation. This is not, then you are turning the message of the gospel into Jesus not being the path, but Jesus teaching a path. Okay? And again, the point we're trying to make here is showing how Christianity is so starkly different from other religions. And how at its root, because the other religions would say, oh yeah, we know the bad stuff is bad, but the good stuff is pretty good. But we know the Bible teaches the bad stuff is bad, and you know what? The good stuff is pretty bad too. And we can't, it's not about the good stuff. It's not about outweighing the good stuff with the bad stuff. It's about throwing it all away and trusting in a person, trusting in Jesus and not in my own ability to create some kind of thing. And so even this sort of effort to emulate Jesus or to look at Jesus as being a great teacher is a rejection of Jesus, because that's not what he taught. It just becomes a Christianized form of religion, of self-effort. It is, one of the things he says, it is possible to avoid Jesus as Savior as much by keeping all the biblical rules as by breaking them, because both are sin. So, changing our behavior is not enough, because we can't be sure when we're good enough. I mean, we've all heard this. We know that salvation is not through works, but again, this is, we're trying to bring people's mindset into a new worldview, into a different way of looking at things. And that it's not about behavior, but it's about a complete transformation of the motives, because like Jekyll and Hyde, his motives ended up being selfish. He wanted to do the good things because he didn't like that evil part of him. He wasn't necessarily doing those things for the people. He was doing it to help clean himself up. So when we are putting forth moral effort, when somebody thinks that they're going to somehow earn their way into heaven with moral effort, it's self-centeredness, because they're only thinking about themselves. That's their motive. Whereas with true salvation, the message of the gospel is you will be transformed first. And I will change the motives. God says, I will change your motives so that now the things you do, you don't have to worry about trying to get something out of it. You've got everything you're going to get. You've got everything you're ever going to get, and all you could even imagine, it's yours. Now do it because you love the person. Do it because you love me. And it changes your motives, and it's a complete transformation of you as a person.
Rick?
Yep.
Are the Beatitudes part of that transformation?
Yeah. Because that's the living out of that transformation that's taking place.
Yeah, it's not a set of rules. This is what.
Right. It's how the righteous will live. So it's like in Galatians when it says, walk in the Spirit and you will not fulfill the lust of the flesh. It doesn't say, don't fulfill the lust of the flesh and then you'll walk in the Spirit. You start with the transformation. You start with, now I'm not, my motives, my mindset, my whole internal makeup is different. I'm walking in the Spirit now, and now watch as my behavior begins to change because of the change that has taken place in my heart. It's a change from the inside out.
I'm saying a lot of people, and I know myself way back when, those are like rules.
Yeah.
They're interpreted that way.
Yeah. I heard somebody once say that right behavior will never create right thinking. Right thinking will create right behavior. The Bible talks about having our mind transformed. And by having our mind transformed and having the mind of Christ, that then results in a change of behavior to where you can't do those things that are talked about in the Beatitudes unless that transformation, at least not for a long and extended period of time. You can work it up in the flesh and you can try to put it on. But even if you were to carry out all those things on your own, it's still in the flesh. It's still, you're doing it to make yourself feel better. You're doing it to try to earn something. You're doing it, it's like, Brahani tells me all the time when he was with Jehovah's Witnesses. He would go out, right? He would go out and do things and share the gospel with people, and then he'd go home and he'd record how many hours, right? I have to keep track of all the good things I do because I want to be able to get rewarded for it. Where's the motive?
I try to go even with God.
Yeah. Yeah, try to get even with God,
Yeah, he do for me this, I do for him this.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's with Christianity, it's not, well, if God does this for me, then I'll do that for him. It's, God has done everything for me, so God, what do you want me to do? It's a different mindset. Aside from that, if somebody has in their mindset that it's about moral behavior, and they don't even necessarily realize that it's self-serving motives, that ultimately results in Phariseeism. I mean, that's what the Pharisees were all about. Was about their own self-righteousness, about how they were able to keep the rules. But the result of them, you would think that the result of somebody who kept the law, who kept the rules, they would be loving, they would be kind, there would be some kind of a beneficial, positive outlook. But they were just mean, harsh people, because the damage, and what he gets into in the book is the damage of Phariseeism. First of all, it damages the Pharisee. There's damage to their own soul. Want me to get that?
No, I got it, thanks.
There's damage to their own soul. They live a life of despair because their identity is based on their behavior. And the one person you really can't fool besides God is yourself. You can pretend to fool yourself. You can pretend to lie to yourself. And you can sort of pretend to kid yourself. But in the long run, you're not. You know the things that you do when nobody else is looking, and the things that you think, the attitudes you have, the thoughts you have towards people that nobody else has, and yet they're putting on this air of righteousness. And so, their identity is based on their behavior, but they know that their so-called outward behavior does not match up with what's going on in their heart. So their identity is all swirled up. And this ends up pouring out and creating social strife, because all this gets poured out on people, because they need to attack those that disagree with them in order to shore up their own righteousness. It's the classic thing. In order for me to be right, you have to be wrong. In order for me to feel comfortable that I'm right, then I have to, squash anybody that disagrees with me. Because God forbid they might make sense. Or they might. That's why they hated Jesus, because they couldn't win an argument with him because he made too much sense. He gave truth, and they tried to out-argue him. They tried to out-lawyer him, and they couldn't stand the fact that here was this guy that didn't look like them and didn't act like them, yet he was clearly more righteous than they were, and they knew it. And their habit was to make sure that they kept a distance from people. So it sort of creates this social strife, this anxiety, so that people resented the Pharisees. And this is what we have. Phariseeism was not just in Jesus' day. Phariseeism is alive and well in the so-called church of Christ, if we want to call it that, in Christendom, if you will. And it's no wonder that so many people come and see that, and then they reject Christianity. And And they are, as Ray Comfort calls, they're inoculated. Because they've seen that, and that's it. You're not going to get them to darken the doors of a church again, because they say, I've been there. I've already had that vaccine. I'm not getting infected with that now. I'm not going back to that. And they think, I've already seen what it all has, and they don't want any piece of it. And unfortunately, it's like we've been reading in the Gospels about Jesus' encounter with the Pharisees, and he says, the problem with you is you don't go in, you don't go through the door to heaven, and you keep out others because of your behavior. You block the door for others. And that's what happens in a lot of churches today because of this self-centered, this religious mindset and not the gospel. Again, the point of all this is that this is the picture that people have when they think of Christianity. They say, why is Christianity any different? So what? All right, so I'm a sinner, so I need to be fixed. Any religion can do that. Christianity isn't any different than any other religion, except that Christianity is not a religion. It's the gospel. So, the difference in the gospel is grace. Oops, let me just try to advance my thing here. So the points that we're doing here. The difference of grace. Religion says, I obey, therefore I am accepted by God. There is some reward for being obedient. And if I do these things, then God will be pleased with me and He'll accept me. That's religion. The gospel says, I am accepted by God through what Christ has done. Therefore, I obey. See, He turns everything on its head. That obedience becomes the byproduct of acceptance, instead of acceptance being the reward for obedience. The gospel basically says this: I am so flawed that Jesus had to die for me. Yet I am so loved and valued that Jesus was glad to die for me. So, if I realize that Jesus had to die for me, then it's humbling. I know somebody had to pay the price for my sin. Somebody had to pay the price because I'm broken. It's a humbling thing when somebody has to pay for you. But yet, the other side of grace is that, grace humbles me more deeply than religion ever could, but yet it affirms me more powerfully than any religion ever could. Grace humbles me to the point where I know that I owe a debt, but it picks me up and strengthens me because I know I'm accepted. And I know I don't have to prove anything. I don't have to prove anything to people, and I don't have to prove anything to God. So it affirms me more, because religion is only going to beat me down. Religion ultimately is only going to show me that I don't measure up. So, this way, a Christian's identity, as opposed to a Pharisee, their identity is not based on behavior or other people's perception of me, as a Christian. I don't base my identity on, do people see me as a good person? Do people see me as being a good Christian? That's not my identity. My identity is God's value of me in Christ. Then we talked about this last week. How does God see me? It doesn't matter how other people see me. How does God see me? In your book, on page 189, he talks about what is called the threat of grace, which I thought was pretty cool. It really caught my attention, as you don't think of grace as being threatening. And it's right after the threat of grace. I think it's in the beginning of the second sentence there, or the third sentence. If that is Christian, because he's talking about how when people first hear this, when people start hearing about the gospel of grace, they say, well, if that is Christianity, all I have to do is get a personal relationship to God and then do anything I want. But this is what I thought was cool. Those words, however, can only be spoken on the outside of an experience of radical grace. No one from the inside speaks like that. In fact, grace can be quite threatening. And what he means by that is, he sort of recounts an encounter that he had with a woman, and she said how grace can be scary. And she said, because if I'm saved by works, then there's a limit to how much God can ask of me. Because, I'm sort of getting myself there. If my works is getting me into heaven, then there's only so much that God can ask of me because I'm already putting so much into it in order to get there. And he likens it unto like paying your taxes. You pay your taxes, you expect the police to show up. There's some things, I'm paying, what's the phrase today? Pay to play. I'm putting it in, I expect to get something back. So if my salvation is by works, then there's only so much that God can ask of me. But if my salvation is of sheer grace, then there is nothing that God cannot ask of me. Because he has provided everything. And I have earned nothing, and I have done nothing to deserve it. So there's nothing that he cannot ask of me. And the way that this is different is now we are submitted to a sovereign Lord. It's not about a practice. It's not about a philosophy or a procedure or a formula. It becomes about, as we always say, it's about a relationship. It's about our having a relationship of submission and subjecting ourselves to a sovereign Lord. 1 Corinthians 6:20 and 1 Corinthians 7:23 says, we are not our own, we are bought with a price. And if you're bought and paid for, then you're subject to whoever it was that paid the price. And again, from the outside, this can look coercive. This can look like, well, now God is just forcing his will upon us by so-called purchasing us. But it's not, like he says here. Nobody, that's something you might say being on the outside, but when you're on the inside, when you are the recipient of grace, and in this room, we all know, we don't feel, that's why it sounds strange to say that grace is threatening, that grace could ever be conceived as coercive, because it's not. We're glad to do the things that we do. Anything that God asks us to do, we want to know more. God, if you could, we want clarity. God, what do you want me to do? Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. When you really understand the radical aspect of grace, then you're more than happy to do it. It's a joy. It's not coercion. It's like when you love somebody, you anticipate their wants and their needs. You love to do it. It's not coercion. You want to do it. You want to do something for somebody because it's something that they love. Whatever it may be, whether it's a child, whether it's a spouse, a friend, there's something that they love. You're not feeling coerced into doing things that they enjoy. It's something you want to do, So it's a complete change of a worldview. It's seeing that Christianity is the answer because it's radically different from religion. The gospel is not anything like religion. And the bottom line is this, and this is, we all, Tony, Jeff,
I didn't mean to interrupt you.
that's okay.
Trying to wrap my brain around something here. I know of Christians that are alive right now and some that have gone, passed on to be with the Lord, who live their whole lives without never understanding any of these concepts that are portrayed here, and yet they've lived lives that are pleasing to the Lord. I know some personally. How does this happen? I mean, something clicks in with these people. It just.
Yeah, well, because we're just articulating these things. We're teaching these things. And this is something for us to sort of, I'm hoping as you're seeing this, this is not so much fresh and new as an affirmation
Right.
of something you already know. You know, and they may not have been taught this, or they may not have,
They couldn't verbalize it.
yeah, that may not be something that you verbalize, because a relationship is not something you can verbalize, but people can understand it. You know, if people come forward for salvation, what do they know of theology? You know, what do they, you know, they don't understand, but they're saved, and they're born again, and they're, you know, they're as pleasing to the Lord as anybody else. And they can live a life that is pleasing to the Lord, that is dedicated to the Lord, in obedience to God, understanding that relationship without having to read a book about it, because it's something that's going on in the relationship. You know, this is just putting it to words. This is just verbalizing. You know, like I said, I'm hoping that, you know, what I'm saying is just more of an affirmation of what God is already doing in your heart. You know, and like I said every week, I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but this is trying to articulate some things for us to be able to, because sometimes we do have a hard time when somebody who is not a believer, and we're trying to share our faith with them. And sometimes it's hard for us to articulate why we love Jesus, you know, and why we believe. It's like, you know, and, you know, particularly maybe the guys can all sort of identify with me on this, is, you know, when your wife turns to you and says, "Why do you love me?" I don't know if I can articulate and put words and sentences to why I love you. I mean, I love you. You're, you know, you could say all kinds of complimentary things, but, you know, sometimes things are difficult to articulate when they're, you know, when they're matters of the heart, so to speak.
I was just thinking that these might be some of the situations and cases where our lives become the message.
Yeah.
You know, where in certain instances you can't verbalize it to somebody, or maybe they're not capable of understanding it, but they can sure look at your life.
Yeah. Well, and that's just it, because they see somebody's life is different. It stands out because it is not what they see in other religions. It's not what they see in other faiths and belief systems, and, you know, or even in themselves, as somebody who may be trying to work their way into heaven, has this philosophy that, hey, so long as I'm, you know, good. Sometimes they look at people and they go, "This guy's different." It's like there's something different on the inside, you know. And again, the difference is who they're living for. You know, who is their God? Everybody has a God. You know, it just depends on if their God is God. You know, they're all living for something, whether it's a relationship, whether it's their family, you know, whatever it is they put on that pedestal, like we talked about, you know, whatever they put on that pedestal, they're going to sort of build their life around that thing. And if it's anything other than God, then they ultimately are not going to feel fulfilled. But then they see somebody who is fulfilled, whose life is lived in submission to God. And submission being a good thing, because it's being surrendered to God, you know, because grace motivates us to give up our control. You know, when, you know, it's the classic thing. If somebody does something really amazing for you, your response, our natural response is, look, whatever you want, you say the word, I'm yours. You know? And it's not in this thing, well, I've got to pay this guy back for. Sometimes, you know, especially if it's for a friend, they're not looking for financial reimbursement, but you have been connected to this person in such a way that you say, look, the fact that you did this for me means, you know, I want to reciprocate it just as a response to the love. You know, and if you need something, you just pick up the phone, and I'm there. And, you know, and this is the relationship that the gospel gives us with God. You know, and the only thing that grace truly threatens is the illusion that people have that they're free. You know, well, I'm not going to live in submission to some God, some capricious God. You know, I'm going to just do whatever he says. I'm a free man and I'm self-ruling and I do what I want. Yeah, you think. You're driven by whatever your God is. Whatever you have put on that pedestal, that is controlling everything that you do. You may not think it. You think you're free, but you're not. Grace, true radical grace, the offer of it, okay, it's all free, all you have to do is take it. There's always the idea of, well, who am I going to have to thank for this? You know, what does this mean? Does this mean I have to give up my freedom? Because if he does all this for me, then I can't do whatever I want. I'm going to have to serve him. And grace sort of shatters this illusion that we're free. So the bottom line is that if somebody is seeing Christianity as a religion, as it's something to follow, and that Jesus is just a teacher and not a savior, then that's all they see, is they see a religion. And they miss the gospel, and they're not changed. You know, and that's, you know, that is the difference between religion and the gospel, and why Christianity is the only answer for what's wrong with us. Because religion can, at least on an external basis and maybe on a temporary basis, you know, change our behavior. It can get us to behave a certain way, but it never fixes that problem of sin with the big S. You know, it may seem to clean up the sins, but only the true gospel is the deliverance from the real problem that's going on in our heart. So then we move on to the next chapter, which is the true story of the cross, because it's sort of a logical progression as we're talking about the gospel. And you know, the key thing about the gospel is the cross. I mean, it is the central point in human history, and it's the primary symbol for Christianity. It's at the heart of the gospel, the good news. But most people who see Christianity as a religion, they look at the cross and they go, that's just silliness. What is that all about? Why is everybody so obsessed? Why are Christians so obsessed with this idea of Jesus dying on the cross? You know, you see it as ludicrous, even sinister. You know, some even see it, well, God had to punish his own son. That's like child abuse. You know, that God would torture his own son. Why would God do that to his own son? You know? And you know, I've had people to tell me, that doesn't make sense. Why did Jesus have to die for my sin? You know? I mean, because we don't see it expressed that way in society so much, that somebody would die for my sins. So it doesn't compute with people. People say, why did Jesus have to die? You know, why can't God just accept everyone? Why can't God just say, I love everybody, I accept everybody, you know, or at least forgive those that are sorry, those that express some remorse. You know, yeah, I know I'm a sinner, so God, can't you just forgive me? Why did Jesus have to die on a cross? Is it enough that I can just be sorry for my sins? You know what? Why can't Christianity focus more on Jesus' teachings rather than his death? Why is his death so central to the message of the gospel? So, you know, why did Jesus have to die? Well, reason number one, and this is I think a really interesting explanation that gives an analogy that we can all wrap our brain around. Real forgiveness is costly suffering. And in the book, he gives an example. He says, look, let's say you were going to let your friend borrow your car, and he's backing out of your driveway. On the way out, he hits your fence, and he knocks over your fence. Now, you've got two choices, basically. You can tell him, look, you're paying for that fence. You know, I'm going to get an estimate, and you're going to cut me a check, and you're going to pay me back for what it costs to fix that fence. Or you can say, don't worry about it, I'll take care of it. You know, you could work out an option where, you know, okay, you pay half, I'll pay half. But the bottom line is this: somebody's paying for that fence. Somebody has to pay for what happened. You can't just forgive, okay, I forgive you. Now it all goes away, the fence is fixed. No, something has to be rectified. You know, the damage is done. You know, someone has to bear the cost of the damage. You know, the debt doesn't just vanish. Forgiveness, now if I forgive the guy who wrecked my fence, I say, don't worry about it, I forgive you. Then that means that I bear the cost of the damage. You know, and to then keeping this sort of in the human realm or in the earthly realm, but taking it a step further, rather than looking at it as something like a fence or something, you know, having to do with money. If somebody wrongs me, and I'm not talking about something petty, something small. Somebody does something really wrong to me. I feel injured. There's an injury. There's damage to be done. I mean, there's damage that's been done, and we're sort of left with the same choice. You know, a debt has been, you know, we sort of feel like a debt has been incurred. You did me wrong. And there is a debt that is happening in the relationship. And I have the same two choices. I can make them pay through taking away the relationship. I don't want to talk to you again, or, you know, or bad-mouthing them and going after them and talking about them and, you know, trying to make them pay for what they did to me. Or I can forgive them and say, look, I'm not going to expect anything from them. I don't want anything, no restitution, nothing. I'm going to let it go. But if that's the case, then I'm bearing the burden. And if you've ever been really wrong, then I've had to sort of swallow that and say, you know what, I'm going to forgive them. If you've ever forgiven somebody, then you sort of bear the burden. You know, and to give it an example, let's just say there's infidelity in a marriage. And the partner that was the victim decides, well, look, you know, I've decided to forgive. I've decided to forgive, we'll work on our marriage, and, you know, we're going to make it work, but I've decided to forgive. Well, if you've decided to forgive, then you forgive. You know, you can't say, well, I'm going to forgive them, but I'm going to make them pay. Well, then that's not forgiveness. Then you're making them bear the burden of the thing that they did wrong. But if you forgive them, then there is an agony that goes on. There is a suffering that goes on by you sacrificing your right to say anything about it. You know, because we feel like, I've got the right. I'm the wrong party here. I get to say stuff about it. I get to complain. I get to ask for some kind of restitution, or I expect something of them because of what they did to me. Well, forgiveness says, no, I don't bring it up. I don't talk about it. And then I bear it. I'm bearing the cost of the damage if I'm the one doing the forgiveness. You know, if I don't do that, then all that's really going to happen is that I become harder and colder and more cynical, and I'm self-absorbed because all I'm thinking about is how this person wronged me and how I've got to get them somehow to pay me back for the damage that they did to me and the way that they hurt me. And it becomes a cycle of reaction and retaliation. I'm going to do something to them, and then they're going to say, well, if you're going to be that way, then here you go back. Yeah, but I was the one that wronged, so there it goes back to you. And it starts a cycle of reaction and retaliation that can go on for years.
Next thing you know, you're a Muslim.
Yeah, yeah, right. Option two, we forgive them, we absorb the debt, and we refrain from retaliation, and we take it upon ourselves. And it is a death. We die to ourselves. We die to our own rights and say, I claim no rights in this. Dead men have no rights. Right? So we claim death in the situation. I'm not going to claim any rights to be able to say one thing about it. You know? And the hard thing is that, we think, yeah, but I don't feel like I'm forgiving them. Well, that's okay. The feeling will come later. Forgiveness is something that, it has to be granted before it's felt. You can't say, well, I'll wait till I feel like I want to forgive them, then I'll forgive them, because that's not going to happen. You have to forgive them, you have to let them go, because, and this is where we sort of get into an interesting analogy here, because what happens is after we go through that death, and we, sacrifice our right to retaliate, in time, we truly do begin to forgive them. And it's like after the death is a resurrection. We come out on the other side and we're at peace and we're free. There's no cycle of evil going on. There's been a reconciliation, there's been a restoration in the relationship. Now, should people be held accountable? Yes, but first of all, it doesn't mean you're saying, by forgiving somebody, you're not saying that what they did was okay. And that's sort of a misunderstanding that people have. That if I forgive somebody, then I'm telling them that I'm okay with it. And you're not. Forgiving somebody just means there's not going to be any retaliation, and you're not going to require anything of them for it. Now, you can hold them accountable to a degree to where, for just using the example, that if there's infidelity in a marriage, there are things that need to be worked out. Obviously, there's something wrong in the marriage, something wrong in that person's life that needs to be, they need to have their relationship with God corrected. And there are things that need to be done, but the point is not, the motive is not retaliation, the motive is restoration. You're not doing it so that they will pay. You're doing it to restore them. It's restoration, not vengeance. Galatians 6 said, if anyone among you is overtaken in a sin, restore such a one. And the word restore there is a medical word that means to set a bone. You want it back to healthy again. Matthew 18 talks about if your brother, if you have aught with a brother, you go through this process. And if all this happens, it says, if he agrees with you, then you have won your brother. And that's sort of the point. The point of the accountability, of holding the person accountable for what they did, is, okay, well, let's talk about what you did for the purpose of restoration, for the purpose of restoring your relationship with God and restoring our relationship. Because over the years, I've sat and counseled couples where there was infidelity, and the injured party is willing to forgive, and then I would turn to the other person and say, now look, here's the thing, forgiveness is free, trust is earned. You're being offered forgiveness, which is a free gift, and it's you're not being asked to pay for what you did, but understand that if you want to win this person's trust back, you're going to have to earn it. And that's that's sort of the restoration. That's holding them accountable for what they did without vengeance, without trying to make them pay for what they did. So this brings us into the forgiveness of God. Why God can't just forgive, because nobody just forgives. If somebody does something really, really wrong to you, you don't just say, I'm going to let it go. Again, if it's an infidelity in a marriage, I can't think of any spouse who would say, no big deal. I'll just forgive him. No, there's a process that has to take place. Somebody has to bear the cost. Forgiveness means that you bear the cost instead of making the wrongdoer do it. This is the forgiveness of God. Rather than making us bear the cost of our sin, He bears the cost of our sin. So the cross is the ultimate demonstration of forgiveness. That's why the cross is so necessary. Without the cross, there cannot be forgiveness. Forgiveness is just not a magic wand that gets waved. Okay, God, just forgive. Well, yeah, God can just forgive. But in order to forgive, somebody has to bear the cost of the damage that was done. And people don't get it because they don't understand how sin hurts God. How our sin is an offense to God. And not that God is so offended by it. But it is our sin, anything we do, even if we do it to somebody else, is against God. You know, it is against God alone that we sin. And because it is a violation, not of his law, but it's a violation of his character. And God is so pure, he cannot look upon iniquity, so it is an offense to him. And it is a heavy offense. You know, so the cross is necessary in order for that offense to be paid for. It's the ultimate demonstration of forgiveness. And getting back to that issue of it being child abuse, that God would punish his own son, well, it's not child abuse because God did not inflict this on someone else. He inflicted it upon himself. Because the Son is God. And so God, you know, and that's forgiveness. Forgiveness is not, you know, okay, so if I have a spouse that was unfaithful to me, then I'm just going to punish my child for that. You know, I'm going to let my child bear the burden of that. No, that's not what God did. God bore it on himself in the person of Jesus Christ, but he still bore it upon himself. You know, and it's not like religions, it's not like pagan or primitive religions that demands our blood. If you want to appease God, then you have to offer your own blood or some human sacrifice of some kind. He became human to offer his own blood, to offer forgiveness. So then reason number 2 is real love is a personal exchange. Beyond the issue of forgiveness, the purpose of the cross was for Christ to identify with us, to have a personal exchange with us. You know, that if you don't have the cross, then you don't have a God of love, because the cross is the ultimate demonstration of love. That he loved us so much that he would do this. That he would, you know, because being God, he doesn't have to bear the price. He can say, look, you know, pay for your own sin. Spend eternity in hell. I don't have to forgive you. He forgives us because he loves us. And the cross is sort of that dual demonstration of his forgiveness. It is the process of his forgiveness, but it's also the demonstration of his love. You know, because when we love somebody, there is a sense of sharing or even changing places with them. You know, I'm not having children, I've never felt this, but I've heard many, many parents say, when I see my child hurting, I want to take it from them and put it on me. I hate to see my child in pain. I hate to see my child hurt. And if I could, I would take all the bad things and take it off of them and put it on me. And that's self-sacrificing love. That's what love means. It means it's not enough for me to just forgive. I want to remove it and I want to put it on me. I want to share in that. I want to, you know, and Jesus shared in that with us. He was tested on all points. He was like us in every way. And he took all that upon himself. And if you have ever been with somebody who is in a bad way, if you've ever spent time trying to help somebody who is emotionally distraught, perhaps they lost a loved one, what you will find, and if you're there and you're trying to encourage them and you're lifting them up and you're trying to help to alleviate some of the pain that they're going through, you're going to find that in your effort to alleviate their emotional distress, you become emotionally drained. There is a part of you that goes out to them, you know, and this is what we call empathy. You know, it's desiring to take another person's pain upon yourself. That is a demonstration of love. That is the transaction, the personal transaction that happened at the cross, was that Jesus is empathizing with us. He is feeling our pain. He's taking our sin upon himself and identifying himself with us. Gives the example of when we love our children, sometimes it's a self-sacrificing love, but we have to decide it's them or us. If your finances are so tight that you have enough food for some of the members of the family, well, then parents typically will, okay, will the kids eat, and I'll go without. That's that's what love is. In your book on page 202, there's a quote from John R.W. Stott. He says, "The essence of sin is we human beings substituting ourselves for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for us. We put ourselves only where only God deserves to be. God puts himself where we deserve to be." How can he be a God of love if he does not become personally involved? It's not some distant thing where he just sort of pays some transaction. He becomes personally involved with our suffering, with our pain. He can't be a God of love without doing that. And only Christianity claims this, that God does this. Only Christianity claims that God has identified with us. The last thing is this idea of the great reversal, which is that Jesus not only, and this is part of this personal transaction, that Jesus not only suffered for us, but he also suffered with us. He identified with, here he is, the king of the universe, the ultimate expression of power in the universe, and he is displayed as the weakest of all mankind. And he identifies with the weak. He's not, all of the religions show God as some powerful being, unless it's some religion of just philosophy like Buddhism or Hinduism, but they all show, but even in Hinduism, the gods are mighty, powerful beings. Nobody demonstrates God. In Islam, God is great and mighty and sovereign and capricious. He does not humiliate himself for mankind. Even in Judaism, God is portrayed as great and mighty. Only in Christianity does God humiliate himself to identify with us and demonstrate this reversal of values. Jesus turns the values of the world upside down, that he wins through losing, he triumphs through defeat, he achieves power through weakness. It runs contrary to the model of dog eat dog and survival of the fittest, that Jesus would offer himself and demonstrate himself as being weak. It creates a new counterculture because our priorities change. In the book he gives the example of how, for somebody who's truly following and serving Jesus, money is something that is to be given away, not something that is to be hoarded. Money is for others. Money is for the purpose of giving to those who need it. And power, the world's position, the world's understanding of power and authority is to rule, to reign, to be in charge, to be able to tell people what to do. The Christian definition of power is having this ability so that you have what you need in order to serve. Power is for service. That in the Bible, the Bible's definition of leadership is the one who serves the most. You know, and Jesus just turns all these ideals on their head. So on the cross, justice is met for the cost of our sin, and mercy is met in his identifying with us and his becoming nothing. You know, in the world's economy, justice and mercy are two different things. What do you want? You want justice, or do you want mercy? You know, like we said last week, well, for other people we want justice. For us, we want mercy. Well, the cross, just as we see in the Psalms, it says, righteousness and peace have met together, justice and mercy have kissed each other. That the two come together at the cross. That he can pay for our sin, he can bear the burden for our sin, and he can identify with us. And be one of us in the process. You know, so when we look at this idea of the cross and why did Jesus have to die? Why is the cross necessary? You know, why did Jesus have to die? It was for us, not for himself. It was because it was what was needed in order to provide our salvation. Now, next week is going to be the last week. I encourage you to come. If you haven't read ahead, how many have read ahead? Have read up to the dance of God. Really good chapter. Really amazing, just a great visualization of just how the Trinity works, how the Godhead relates to one another, and how we can sort of be incorporated into that. So if you can, read ahead and be here next week to do that. Some great, plus a great chapter on the resurrection. We're going to talk about some of that stuff. Some great things. Any questions, comments? All right, let's have a little early this week. Let's pray. Thank you so much for the cross, for the price that you paid, and for the love that you have, with which you have loved us, that made our salvation possible. And Father, help us to, even though we know these things, help us to be able to articulate these things as people ask us why we believe what we believe, and how our faith is so different from all other religions. And that these things be personal, but also be something that we can talk out and give a reason for. So Father, we thank you again for this evening, and ask you to bless us now as we go. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.